A white police officer, his badge gleaming under the sun, stands on the steps of the Clarksville precinct and does the unthinkable. He looks a well-dressed black man straight in the eyes and spits at his feet. The crowd falls into stunned silence. A cell phone is already recording every moment. What Officer Reed Harlan does not know, what nobody in that parking lot knows except one man, is that the person he just humiliated is the man who will soon walk into that same precinct and sit behind the chief's desk as the brand new commanding officer. And that is only the beginning of this story. The summer arrived in Clarksville, Georgia, like a slow fever, humid, stubborn, and suffocating, the kind of heat that made tempers short and judgment even shorter. Officer Reed Harlan, a veteran of the Clarksville Police Department, pulled into the precinct parking lot one morning in his personal truck, a lifted black Ford F-250 with a thin blue line sticker across the back windshield. Country music played loud enough that the bass rattled the windows of the cars parked beside him. He was broad-shouldered with a jaw like a brick and eyes that had learned over the years on the force to assess and dismiss in the same glance. His colleagues called him Brick, partly for his jaw, partly for the wall he put up the moment anyone questioned the way he did things. Reed Harlan was not what anyone would call overtly cruel. He did not scream slurs on the street corner. He did not patrol with a sneer permanently fixed to his face. By the department's own metrics, he was a technically competent officer who had received commendations for arrests that cleared major drug cases and one formal reprimand that had been quietly buried after his union rep, a sharp-tongued man named Keith Barlow, made enough noise to keep it from becoming a permanent stain. The reprimand had been for excessive force during a stop involving a black teenager named Jamal Hayes. Reed had slammed the boy into the hood of his cruiser over what turned out to be a misunderstanding about a backpack that contained nothing more threatening than a library book and a half-eaten bag of pretzels. That incident had cost Jamal Hayes stitches above his left eyebrow. It had cost Reed Harlan nothing except a piece of paper that no longer existed. That morning, as Reed Harlan climbed out of his truck and stretched in the parking lot sun, he noticed a man standing near the precinct's front entrance. The man was black, impeccably dressed in a charcoal gray suit with a white pocket square folded into a precise triangle. He carried a slim leather briefcase in one hand and held his phone to his ear with the other, speaking quietly, seemingly absorbed in his conversation. He had the bearing of someone accustomed to commanding rooms, still, deliberate, watchful. The kind of posture that does not announce itself, but is impossible to ignore once you notice it. Reed noticed it, and something about it irritated him immediately. The man was just close enough to the entrance that Reed would have to pass within a few feet of him to reach the door. No one else was in the parking lot at that moment, just the two of them, the heat, and the hum of cicadas in the oak trees at the lot's edge. Later, Reed would struggle to explain what came over him. He had given statements to Internal Affairs, to his union, to his own wife. And in each version, the explanation was slightly different, slightly more polished, slightly more distorted by self-preservation. But witnesses who would come forward in the days that followed would all describe the same thing. Reed Harlan slowed his stride. He looked the man up and down with the particular brand of contempt that does not need words to communicate itself. And then, with a casualness that was almost worse than rage, he tilted his head to the left and spat a thick, deliberate arc of saliva that landed directly at the man's polished left shoe. The man on the phone stopped mid-sentence. He looked down at his shoe. He looked up at Reed. He said nothing. Reed said nothing either. He pushed through the precinct door without breaking stride, letting it swing shut behind him. The man on the phone was named Victor Langford, and he was soon to become the chief of police of Clarksville, Georgia. To understand the magnitude of what Reed Harlan had just done, you need to understand who Victor Langford was, not just what he was about to become, but where he had come from and what it had cost him to get there. Victor Langford was born in Macon, Georgia, the second of 4 children raised by his mother, Clara Langford, a school cafeteria worker, and his father, Thomas Langford, a mechanic who moonlighted as a deacon at First Baptist Church on Jefferson Street. They were not poor, but they were close enough to poor that Victor had learned early the value of precision in how he dressed, how he spoke, how he carried himself, because he understood from a young age that black men in Georgia did not receive the benefit of the doubt. They received scrutiny. And so, he had armed himself with excellence, the way other men armed themselves with volume. He had graduated valedictorian from Ballard Hudson High School, received a full academic scholarship to Morehouse College, and then done something that surprised nearly everyone who knew him. He had joined the Atlanta Police Department as a young man, passing on law school because he believed with the stubborn, almost naive sincerity of a young man raised by a deacon that he could change things from the inside. What followed was a career that would have broken most men. Victor Langford rose through the Atlanta PD with the methodical determination of someone who refused to be defined by the obstacles placed in front of him. He made detective early in his career. He headed the Major Crimes Unit after some years. He survived 2 separate attempts by colleagues to derail his career. One, a fabricated allegation of evidence tampering that fell apart under investigation because Victor had maintained meticulous records, and another, a political maneuver by a deputy chief who saw Victor as a threat and quietly reassigned him to a desk position designed to make him quit. He did not quit. By the time he reached senior leadership, he was deputy commissioner of the Atlanta Police Department, overseeing a department of thousands of officers. He had been married for years to his wife, Evelyn Langford, a pediatric nurse with a sharp mind and sharper humor, and had a daughter, Nia Langford, who had followed her father into law and was working in her first year at the Fulton County District Attorney's Office. When the city of Clarksville opened a national search for a new police chief, following the forced resignation of the previous chief in a scandal involving misallocated department funds and a federal investigation, Victor Langford's name had been at the top of the short list almost immediately. Commissioner Philip Hargrove, a political veteran who had spent years trying to modernize Clarksville's department without quite having the courage to do it, had personally recruited Victor after conversations with 2 former Atlanta mayors, who described him in terms usually reserved for eulogies. The appointment had been announced internally to the city council, to department leadership, to the union, but had not yet been made public. Victor was at the precinct that morning for what was officially a facility familiarization visit, a walkthrough of the building, a review of administrative records, a series of quiet introductory meetings with the precinct's senior staff. He had been asked to keep a low profile. The commissioner wanted the announcement to land with impact, not leak out through the side door. Victor had agreed. He had arrived early, stood near the entrance to take a call from Commissioner Hargrove, and had been minding his own business when a veteran of the Clarksville PD walked past him and spat on his shoe. He did not react, not because he was not capable of reaction, but because in his long career in law enforcement, Victor Langford had learned that the loudest response is not always the most powerful one. He ended his call, looked down at his shoe, looked at the door through which Reed Harlan had disappeared, and said nothing. He reached into his briefcase, removed a small cloth, wiped his shoe clean, and walked inside. But he remembered the face. Victor Langford always remembered faces. Inside the precinct, Reed Harlan moved through his morning with the easy confidence of a man who had never faced a consequence that stuck. He clocked in, poured coffee, exchanged the specific kind of loud, territorial humor that passes for camaraderie in certain locker rooms, and settled at his desk to complete paperwork from the previous week's arrests. His partner, Wayne Fletcher, was already at his own desk, a heavy-set man who was sharp in the particular way that some men are sharp, strategically, politically, always calculating the angle. Wayne had been with the department for years and knew where everybody was buried, metaphorically speaking. Mostly, though, there had been one incident years earlier that Wayne sometimes alluded to after his 3rd drink and that no one ever directly acknowledged. Wayne had seen Reed cross the parking lot. He had been at the window filling his water bottle, and he had watched the whole thing through the glass. "You know who that was?" Wayne said, without looking up from his computer when Reed sat down. "Some guy in a suit," Reed said, pulling up his files. "You spit at some guy in a suit." "I spit on the ground." "Next to his shoe." Reed looked up. "You're going to write me up for it?" Wayne stared at him for a long moment with the flat, unreadable expression of a man deciding whether a situation required intervention or containment. Then He shook his head and went back to his screen. "Just asking if you know who it was." "Don't know, don't care," Reed said. Wayne said nothing else. But after Reed went to briefing, Wayne sat very still at his desk for several minutes thinking. He had overheard 2 lieutenants talking that morning, fragments of conversation, and a name mentioned in passing, a reference to the commissioner's office. He had not connected it immediately. Now he was connecting it. Wayne Fletcher typed Victor Langford's name into the department's external public records system and found, in a short time of searching, a profile that described Langford as one of the most influential law enforcement figures in Georgia and mentioned that he was widely regarded as a frontrunner for any major department leadership position that opened in the southeastern United States. Wayne read the article twice. Then he closed the browser tab, stood up, poured his water bottle's contents down the sink, refilled it, and said nothing to anybody for the rest of the day. This was a calculated choice. Wayne Fletcher had survived years in law enforcement by reading the direction of the wind before other people noticed the air was moving. He had decided that whatever was coming, he intended to be on the side of it that wasn't Reed Harlan. Meanwhile, Captain Leland Voss, the precinct's acting commanding officer, a man who had been passed over for the chief's position himself and wore that disappointment like a low-grade infection, had spent the morning giving Victor Langford his facility tour with the barely concealed resentment of a man showing someone else around a house he had wanted to buy. Voss was cordial. He was thorough. He showed Langford the evidence room, the administrative offices, the dispatch center, the holding cells. He answered questions with the clipped efficiency of someone who had rehearsed being professional. He did not mention Reed Harlan. He had not seen the parking lot incident himself, and at that point, he did not know it had happened. Victor Langford asked questions. Good questions, precise questions, the kind that revealed exactly how much he already understood about the department's internal dynamics. He asked about officer retention rates. He asked about the status of 2 ongoing federal compliance reviews. He asked about the filing system for internal affairs complaints and whether the department used a centralized digital platform or maintained paper records. Voss noticed that Langford seemed particularly interested in the internal affairs records. He noted it without commenting on it. By late morning, Victor Langford had completed his walkthrough, shaken Voss's hand, and driven away in a silver Lexus sedan, his face giving away nothing. Soon after, a woman named Meredith Kane, who worked as a paralegal at a firm 2 blocks from the precinct and had been walking to her car when the incident happened, had posted a short video clip to her Twitter account with the caption, "Clarksville PD officer spits at a black man's feet outside the precinct parking lot. Nobody said a word." The clip spread rapidly. It was picked up by local television, the Associated Press, and a national correspondent for CNN who filed the story in time for the evening broadcast. Reed Harlan, who did not follow social media closely and had spent the afternoon on patrol, came home to find his wife, Brooke Harlan, a dental hygienist with a practical mind and a deep-seated fear of financial instability, sitting at the kitchen table with her laptop open and an expression on her face that he had never seen before. It was not anger. It was something more complex than anger. It was the look of someone watching the ground they are standing on begin to crack. "That's you," she said, turning the laptop toward him. "Reed, that's you on the news." Reed watched the clip multiple times. He watched it the way people watch footage of car accidents, unable to stop, unable to look away, each viewing revealing some new detail that made everything slightly worse. The clip was short. In those seconds, you could see Reed's profile clearly, his jaw, the glint of his badge, the deliberate tilt of his head. You could see the arc of the spit. You could see Victor Langford look down at his shoe and then up at Reed. You could see Reed walk away without a single backward glance. The clip had no sound, which somehow made it worse. The silence gave it the quality of pantomime, of something performed for an audience, and the performance was damning. "It's not what it looks like," Reed said. Brooke's voice was very quiet, which in their many years of marriage he had learned to be more afraid of than shouting. "What does it look like?" "It looks like I spit at a guy." "Did you?" A long pause. "I spit on the ground." At his feet. Near his feet. Brooke closed the laptop. Reed. Who is he? I don't know. That was the truest thing Reed Harlan said that night. He genuinely did not know. And the not knowing was beginning to feel like the ground shifting under him, like he had stepped off a ledge in the dark and was still somehow waiting to find out how far the fall was. His phone had been blowing up for hours, mostly from fellow officers, ranging from nervous solidarity to nervous distance, the latter group already recalibrating their association with him. Wayne Fletcher had not called. Reed noticed that. Wayne always called. That evening, Reed received a call from his union rep, Keith Barlow, who opened the conversation with the words, "Reed, I need you to sit down and listen to me very carefully because what I'm about to tell you is going to affect the rest of your career." Reed sat down. "The man in that video," Keith said, "has been appointed Chief of Police of Clarksville PD. The announcement is coming soon. He has already filed an internal complaint. Internal Affairs is going to contact you tomorrow morning. Do not, and I am telling you this as your representative, not your friend, do not speak to anyone in that department without me in the room. Do you understand me?" The silence that followed was heavy. "He's the chief," Reed said. "He is going to be the chief," Keith said. "And even if he were a civilian, Reed, even if he were nobody, what you did on that tape, I'd sit on the ground." Keith's voice was steady, patient, and carrying within its patience the particular weariness of someone who has had this conversation too many times. "Reed, I've watched the clip many times this afternoon. I've shown it to 2 attorneys. I'm going to be honest with you because it's my job to be honest with you. What is on that tape will be interpreted as a racially motivated act of intimidation by a uniformed police officer toward a black man. That is the interpretation. That is what Internal Affairs is going to work with. And the fact that the man in question is about to become your commanding officer, Reed, that is a dimension of this situation that I do not have words for yet." Reed hung up. He sat in his living room in the dark for a long time. Brooke had gone upstairs. He could hear the television in their bedroom, the sound of the evening news muffled through the ceiling, saying his name. He had been in law enforcement for years. He had a pension that was vesting. He had a mortgage on the house, a daughter in community college, and a son in middle school. He had built his entire identity around the badge. Sitting in the dark, Reed Harlan had the disorienting, nauseating experience of understanding, perhaps for the first time, that he had always assumed the badge protected him, not just from criminals, from everything, from consequences, from accountability, from the particular kind of reckoning that other people faced. He was beginning to understand that this assumption had been, in the most comprehensive sense, wrong. The press conference was held at Clarksville City Hall. Commissioner Philip Hargrove stood at the podium in a Navy suit and delivered his remarks about the city's commitment to accountable, transparent, community-centered policing with the practiced sincerity of a politician who has learned that the right words delivered at the right tempo can sound like conviction even when they are merely calculation. He spoke about the selection process. He spoke about the national search. He spoke about the committee that had reviewed applications and conducted interviews. He built toward the name the way a good news anchor builds toward a headline. "It is my honor," Hargrove said, "to introduce Clarksville's new chief of police, a veteran of Georgia law enforcement, former deputy commissioner of the Atlanta Police Department, and a man whose career has been defined by integrity, leadership, and an unwavering commitment to justice. Chief Victor Langford." Victor walked to the podium in a charcoal gray suit, different from the one he had worn earlier, but the same cut, the same precision. He was calm. He had the particular composure of a man who has spent a lifetime training himself not to need the room's approval and who has arrived at a place where he genuinely doesn't. He shook Hargrove's hand. He faced the cameras. He began to speak. He did not mention Reed Harlan in his opening remarks. He spoke about community. He spoke about accountability in law enforcement and among officers. He spoke about the obligation of police departments to reflect the values of the communities they serve. He spoke about what it meant to wear a badge, and he used the word responsibility multiple times, each time with slightly more weight than the last, Every officer who had watched the parking lot clip knew exactly what he was talking about. None of them said it out loud. In the back of the press conference room, Wayne Fletcher stood with his arms crossed, watching. He had come in plain clothes. Nobody had asked him to come. He had come because he had spent the days doing the kind of private recalculation that a man does when he realizes the institutional weather is changing. And he wanted to see the new chief's face in person, wanted to calibrate the reading himself. What Wayne Fletcher saw at that podium was a man who was not performing for the cameras. That was the detail that settled something in Wayne's chest. In his years on the force, he had watched a lot of people behind podiums, commissioners, deputy commissioners, union heads, aldermen, and he had developed a reliable sense for performance versus substance. Victor Langford was substance. Wayne recognized it the way you recognize a certain kind of dangerous current in water that looks still on the surface. Captain Leland Voss was also in the room in uniform, seated near the front. His face was professionally neutral. Inside, he was conducting a very complex and very private set of calculations about his own future. He had been passed over. The man at the podium was now his superior. He would need to decide in the coming weeks which side of history he wanted to stand on. The side of Reed Harlan, which was also the side of the department's existing power structure and all of its embedded assumptions, or the side of the man who had just taken command of that structure and clearly intended to change it. Voss was not a stupid man. He was, in many ways, a self-interested man, and self-interest pointed in a direction that made him uncomfortable. After the press conference, Victor Langford spent time meeting individually with senior staff. He was measured, direct, and listened more than he spoke. He asked each person the same 3 questions in different orders, and he watched what the differences in their answers revealed. Later that afternoon, he called Internal Affairs Lieutenant Naomi Cole into his office, the office that still smelled faintly of the previous chief's cigar smoke and that Victor had already asked to have repainted, and he closed the door. "The Harlan matter," he said. "Where does it stand?" Lieutenant Naomi Cole was a woman who had run internal affairs for some years with the methodical efficiency of someone who understood that her job was to be fair and to be seen to be fair, and who had also learned that those 2 things were not always the same. She was precise, humorless in the professional sense, and deeply, privately relieved that the department finally had leadership that appeared to take internal accountability seriously. "We have the video," she said. "We have a witness statement from the individual who filmed it, Meredith Kane, a paralegal with no connection to the department. We have a formal complaint from you." She paused. "And we have Officer Harlan's union representation, which has requested a hearing." "When is the hearing?" "We've scheduled it for the earliest available slot next week." Victor looked out the window for a moment. "Make sure the process is clean," he said. "By the book, every step." Naomi nodded. She understood what he meant, not because he wanted Reed Harlan to escape accountability through procedural error, but because he needed this to be unimpeachable. He needed it to be something that could not be picked apart, that could not be characterized as a vendetta or a personal score being settled, because that was the trap, and Victor Langford knew it was a trap, and he refused to walk into it. He would let the process work. He would let the evidence speak, and he would make sure that when the speaking was done, there was nothing left to argue about. By the weekend before the hearing, 3 more things had happened. The first, an officer named Devin Brooks, a younger black officer on the force, submitted a voluntary written statement to Internal Affairs in which he described 2 additional incidents involving Reed Harlan that he had witnessed but not reported. A traffic stop in which Reed had used racially derogatory language toward a black driver after the dash cam was turned off, and an incident in the break room in which Reed had made a comment about a neighborhood known to be predominantly black that Devin described in his statement as something I cannot pretend I did not hear. Devin had not reported either incident at the time. In his statement, he explained why. "I did not believe it would result in any action. I did not believe anyone would listen. I am coming forward now because someone is listening." The second development, Wayne Fletcher called Keith Barlow, Reed's union rep. The conversation was short. Wayne told Keith that if asked under oath about what he knew of Reed's conduct, he would tell the truth. He was not offering to testify against Reed. He was informing Keith that he would not testify for him. The distinction was legal and precise and conveyed everything it needed to convey. Keith Barlow called Reed and told him the union's calculus had changed. Reed sat on his porch in the dark after that call and drank 2 beers and stared at his neighbor's lawn for a long time. The third development was the most personally devastating, and it came from a direction Reed had not anticipated. Brooke Harlan called her brother, an attorney named Quentin Reed, who drove to Clarksville and sat across the kitchen table from his brother-in-law and said something that Brooke had been trying and failing to find words for all week. "Reed," Quentin said, "I have watched you for years. I have watched you at family dinners and Christmas mornings and Little League games, and I want to tell you something, and I need you to actually hear it. What you did in that parking lot, the way you did it, the casualness of it, like it didn't even require a thought. That tells me it wasn't the first time. I don't mean the first time you did that specific thing. I mean the first time that version of you showed itself in public where there was a camera." Reed said nothing. "Brooke deserves better than this," Quentin said. "Your kids deserve better than this, and so does that man whose shoe you spit on." Quentin drove back home that night. Brooke made up the guest room and told Reed quietly and without drama that she needed some space to think. The hearing was held in the administrative conference room on the 2nd floor of the precinct. Present were Lieutenant Naomi Cole, 2 members of the Civilian Oversight Board, a retired judge named Warren Beaumont, and a community advocate named Renee Hargrove, along with Keith Barlow representing Reed and Reed himself. Victor Langford was not in the room. He had recused himself from the hearing process formally and on record to avoid any appearance of personal bias. This was noted in the hearing transcript and would later be cited as a demonstration of the exact kind of institutional fairness that the department was supposed to operate under and had for years failed to embody. Keith Barlow's strategy going into the hearing had been to argue context, that the video was ambiguous, that the act of spitting near someone's feet was not legally or procedurally equivalent to spitting on them, that there was no verbal exchange and therefore no way to establish discriminatory intent. It was a strategy that might have worked once in a department where the definition of accountability was negotiable. It did not work. Lieutenant Naomi Cole presented the video, Meredith Kane's statement, Devin Brooks's written submission, and a section of the department's code of conduct that prohibited conduct that demeans, humiliates, or degrades any individual based on race, color, or national origin, whether on or off duty while in uniform. Reed had been in uniform. Judge Warren Beaumont asked Reed directly, "Did you expectorate in the direction of this individual?" Reed, who had been coached by Keith to keep his answers minimal, said, "I spit on the ground." "In his immediate vicinity?" A pause. "Yes." "Was there any interaction between you prior to this act?" "No." "Did you know this individual?" "No." "Had he done or said anything to provoke you?" A long pause. Keith touched his arm. Reed looked at the table. "No." The pause lasted in the room's collective memory and in the written transcript far longer than the seconds it took. Keith made his arguments. The Oversight Board deliberated. The hearing lasted some time. The recommendation issued that afternoon was termination. The formal termination hearing was scheduled for the following week. Between the recommendation and the final decision, the story expanded in ways that neither Reed nor the department could contain. Not because anyone was feeding it deliberately, but because the truth, once it finds a crack in the wall, does not wait for permission. The Atlanta Journal-Constitution ran a long feature by a journalist named Sophia Reyes, who had been covering Georgia law enforcement for years and who wrote with the particular precision of someone who has learned that the most damaging stories require no editorializing, only sequence. She traced Reed Harlan's disciplinary history from the beginning, the incident with Jamal Hayes, the buried reprimand, the chain of union interventions that had repeatedly placed a buffer between Reed's behavior and anything resembling a consequence. She spoke to 3 former colleagues anonymously. Their quotes were careful and controlled in the way that people speak when they are confessing something they are not yet ready to confess completely. She spoke to 2 community members on the record, a woman who ran an after-school program 2 blocks from the precinct, and a pastor whose congregation sat in the exact neighborhood Reed had been assigned to patrol for years. Near the end of the piece, Sophia included a paragraph that the department's press office would later describe in private communications as the paragraph. It laid out in plain arithmetic the full weight of Reed's record. Multiple complaints filed over his years of service, 0 sustained findings, 1 reprimand expunged. The mathematics of impunity displayed without comment, which made it more devastating than any comment could have been. The piece ran and spread widely. The precinct's main phone line logged over many calls before noon, but it was Jamal Hayes who made the week impossible to look away from. He was older now. He sat in front of a local television camera in a neat navy polo shirt, his posture straight, his voice even. And he described the earlier incident with the measured, deliberate language of a young man who had decided that his story deserved to be told clearly and without theater. He described standing outside the CVS. He described the sound of the cruiser door opening. He described the moment his face met the hood of the car, not violently in his telling, but precisely, with the careful accuracy of someone who has replayed a memory so many times it has become cinematic in his mind. He said it had not made sense to him in the moment. He said it had taken him a long time to understand that it did not need to make sense to the person doing it. And then he turned slightly toward the camera and showed the scar above his left eyebrow. A thin, pale ridge, barely an inch long, the physical remainder of a day when a library book and a bag of pretzels had not been enough to prove that he was not a threat. He said, "I'm not surprised this happened to someone else. I'm surprised it took this long for someone to see it." The interview was short. It was the most watched local news segment in Atlanta that week. And by the next morning it had moved beyond local entirely. Captain Leland Voss watched the Jamal Hayes interview from his office with the door closed and the blinds angled so that no one passing in the hallway could see his face. He watched it twice. Then he sat for a long time with his hands folded on his desk, staring at nothing in particular, doing the accounting that men in his position are usually very skilled at avoiding. He had known about the earlier incident. He had not merely failed to escalate it, he had actively participated in minimizing it. He had signed off on language that characterized Reed's conduct as a situational overreaction and recommended the reprimand's expungement on the grounds that Reed's record was otherwise clean and that escalation would be disproportionate to the incident's severity. He had written those words himself. He had believed them, or had chosen to believe them, which in the end amounted to the same complicity. Voss was not a man given to dramatic reckonings. He had spent decades in law enforcement by being practical, by reading the room, by understanding that survival in an institution meant knowing when to move and when to stay still. But watching Jamal Hayes' scar on a television screen in his own office in a precinct, he had helped shape into exactly the kind of place that could produce a Reed Harlan and then protect him for years. Something in Voss shifted. Not dramatically, not with the sudden clarity of a conversion, slowly, like something that had been held under pressure for a long time, finally finding a release valve. He requested a meeting with Chief Langford and placed a document on the desk without preamble. "What is this?" Victor asked. "My full account," Voss said, "of every incident involving Reed Harlan that I was made aware of and did not escalate, including the incident with Jamal Hayes and including my role in recommending the expungement of his reprimand." Victor looked at the document. He did not pick it up immediately. He looked at Voss instead, reading him the way he had spent his career learning to read people, not for what they said, but for what they were willing to carry when they said it. "This is voluntary." "Yes." "Why?" Voss sat with the question. It deserved to be sat with. He was a man who had spent decades telling himself that going along was the same as doing his job, and he had arrived at the slow and uncomfortable realization that it was not. It had never been. Every time he had smoothed something over, signed something off, looked the other direction with the practiced efficiency of institutional habit, it had not been neutrality. It had been a choice, and the choices had accumulated into a record that was now as much his as it was Reed's. "I've been in this department long enough to know what it looks like when things actually change," Voss finally said, "and what it looks like when people just move the furniture around. And I would rather be part of something real at the end of my career than have been part of something rotten the whole time." Victor picked up the document. He turned the first page. "This is going to have consequences for you." "I know. I can't promise you what those consequences will be." "I know that too," Voss said. He stood, straightened his uniform jacket with the habitual precision of long practice, the gesture of a man who has spent so many years in uniform that the body performs its rituals even when the spirit is in open rebellion against everything the uniform has sometimes protected, and walked out. The formal consequences for Captain Leland Voss would ultimately amount to a censure, a demotion in rank, and a suspension. Significant, but not career-ending. He would retire some time later with a lesser pension than he had imagined, and he would spend his retirement coaching youth basketball at a recreation center near the precinct. It was not the ending he had planned, but it was an honest one, and there is a quiet dignity in honest endings that comfortable ones sometimes lack. On the morning of the termination hearing, Reed Harlan drove to the precinct for the last time. He drove in his personal truck. He drove slowly, the country music station off for once, the cab so quiet he could hear the sound of the road under his tires. He had not slept much. He had been awake in the early hours, then given up entirely and sat in the kitchen with coffee, not thinking in the way people sometimes don't think before something significant, holding everything at arm's length because the weight of it, admitted all at once, would be too much. He parked in the same spot. The same heat beginning to build in the early morning air, the same oak trees at the lot's edge releasing the same high, endless sound of cicadas. He sat in the truck for some minutes before he went inside. He noticed in those minutes that the entrance where Victor Langford had stood earlier was empty. Of course it was empty. But he looked at the spot anyway. The exact patch of concrete, the shadow of the doorframe falling across it. And he understood perhaps for the first time with his full self, rather than just the part of him that was managing the crisis, what he had done there. Not just the act, the assumption behind the act. The assumption that the person standing there was someone he did not need to see clearly, someone who did not require the consideration of a second glance. The termination hearing lasted less than an hour. The findings were read into the record. Reed sat with his hands flat on his knees and his jaw set in the expression that had earned him his nickname. And he said, almost nothing. Keith Barlow made a closing argument that was professional and thorough and insufficient. The Civilian Oversight Board delivered its ruling without extended deliberation. Termination, effective immediately with a formal finding of conduct unbecoming and discriminatory behavior in violation of department policy. Reed handed in his badge and his service weapon at the front desk. The officer behind the desk was a young woman named Riley Tran. She took the badge and the weapon and processed them carefully without making eye contact, with the quiet solemnity of someone who understood the weight of what she was handling and did not want to make the moment more theatrical than it had already been. There was something appropriate about that, the lack of theater. Reed had done enough performing. What was left was only the plain paperwork-documented reality of a career ending at a front desk. Reed walked out through the front door and stopped on the steps. The parking lot was empty. The heat was there, the oak trees were there, the cicadas were there, indifferent and constant. He stood in the same air that had surrounded him earlier, in the same geography of concrete and shadow and heat. And he was a completely different person. Not in the deep, transformative way that stories sometimes promise, but in the irreversible way that real life actually delivers. Something was gone that would not come back. Not just the badge, the certainty, the invisible armor of it. The quiet, unexamined belief that he had always moved through the world with that consequence was a thing that happened to other people. He walked to his truck. He drove home. Brooke was there. The guest room bed was still made up, and things between them existed in the fragile, undecided space of two people who love each other, but have discovered that love is not on its own a sufficient answer to the questions they were now required to ask. She did not say anything when he came in. She brought him coffee without being asked and sat down across from him at the kitchen table, and for a long time, neither of them spoke. The silence was not comfortable, but it was honest. And sometimes, that is the only kind worth keeping. "I don't know what comes next," Reed finally said. Brooke wrapped both hands around her mug. She looked at the table, then at him with the expression of a woman who has been thinking for some time about exactly this moment and has arrived at something that is not forgiveness yet, and is not its absence either, something in between, provisional and careful. "Neither do I," she said, "but I know what can't come next, and so do you." In the months that followed, Victor Langford moved through the Clarksville Police Department like a quiet current that gradually reshaped the riverbed. He implemented mandatory bias training, not the performative box-checking kind, but an intensive program developed with the University of Georgia's Criminal Justice Department that required officers to engage with material that was uncomfortable, that asked questions officers were not accustomed to being asked, and that produced results that even the department's most skeptical members struggled to dismiss entirely. He created an early intervention system, a data-driven monitoring process that flagged complaint patterns, use of force incidents, and behavioral red flags before they accumulated into the kind of record that Reed Harlan had been allowed to build without consequence. Lieutenant Naomi Cole led the implementation of the system with the meticulous attention to detail that Victor had recognized in her from the first day. Officer Devin Brooks, the officer whose statement had been the hearing's most unexpected turning point, was promoted to detective within some time. He would later say in an interview with the Clarksville Courier that coming forward had been the most professionally frightening thing he had ever done, and also the most important. Meredith Kane, the paralegal who had filmed the parking lot, received a letter from Chief Langford's office, not thanking her for what she had done, but acknowledging it. The distinction mattered. Victor believed that accountability in public institutions could not depend on individual citizens taking risks to document what institutions were failing to see themselves. The letter said, "What you witnessed should have been caught by our own internal processes long before it reached a parking lot. That is what we are working to change." Meredith had the letter framed. It hung in her office until the day she retired. Jamal Hayes graduated from his nursing program and took a position at Grady Memorial Hospital in Atlanta. He had a scar above his left eyebrow. He did not talk about it often. When he did, he spoke about it the way you speak about something that happened to a version of you who no longer exists, with a certain distance, a certain measured grief, and a certain resolve. As for Reed Harlan, the story of what happened to him afterward is quieter and in some ways more instructive than the dramatic arc of the hearing and the termination. He did not find another law enforcement job. His termination record, public, documented, and now attached to a name that had been in national news, made that effectively impossible. He spent several months trying to figure out what a man does when the identity he has built his entire adult life around is removed. He and Brooke went through a period of genuine crisis, not just in their marriage, but in the more fundamental sense of two people discovering that they have been operating under assumptions about themselves and each other that do not survive close examination. Brooke stayed. It was not a simple decision, and it was not a permanent solution so much as a sustained effort. Couples therapy, difficult conversations, and the slow, unglamorous work of rebuilding something on a more honest foundation than the one it had been standing on. Reed eventually found work in private security. Not glamorous, not well paid by comparison. Not the identity he had wrapped himself in for years, but work nonetheless. He enrolled in a community course on diversity and inclusion, not because he was required to, but because his therapist, a man named Dr. Elliot Ramsey, who specialized in occupational identity and transition, suggested that education, without compulsion, might reach something that mandated training never could. Whether it did is not something Reed would describe as a transformation. It was slower than that, and less certain than that, It was, by his own account in a conversation with Dr. Ramsey, that the doctor would later reference anonymously in a published paper on law enforcement identity. The experience of a man learning painfully and late that the things he had dismissed had weight, that the dismissal itself had weight, and that weight had consequences that could not ultimately be avoided. He thought about Victor Langford sometimes, not with resentment that had burned itself out, but with something that was harder to name. The knowledge that in a single thoughtless act in a parking lot, he had revealed everything that had been hidden in plain sight for years, that the man he had dismissed had walked into his own future without looking back. That dignity in the end had not belonged to the person with the badge. Victor Langford served as chief of police of Clarksville, Georgia for some years. Under his leadership, civilian complaints against officers dropped significantly, use of force incidents declined, and community trust surveys, which the department had never previously administered, showed a sustained upward trend that began in the first year and continued through his tenure. Later, he was appointed to a federal law enforcement advisory board by the Attorney General. He gave a speech at his swearing-in that was later excerpted in a Justice Department publication. The excerpt contained a passage that people who heard the full speech said was the most striking moment in it. "I have learned," he said, "that institutions do not change because they want to. They change because someone makes the cost of not changing higher than the cost of changing. My job every day has been to keep those costs honest." He did not mention a parking lot. He did not mention a spitting incident. He did not mention a name. He didn't need to. The story had already told itself. What happened in that Clarksville parking lot one morning was not just one man's worst moment on video. It was the collapse of a system that had protected the wrong people for far too long, and the arrival of a man who had spent his career preparing without knowing it to dismantle exactly that system from the inside. Victor Langford did not seek revenge. He sought accountability. And he understood better than anyone in that story that those two things are not the same, and that only one of them builds something worth standing on. Reed Harlan lost his badge, his career, and the identity he had built around both. But the harder loss, and the more instructive one, was the loss of the certainty he had never examined, the quiet, unearned certainty that some people are not worth the consideration of a second glance. If this story moved you, if it made you feel something, if it reminded you that justice, when it comes, does not always announce itself loudly, please hit that like button. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe so you never miss the stories that matter. Every share keeps these voices in the conversation. Every like tells the algorithm that truth is worth amplifying. Don't let this story stop here. Let it travel.